I'm Michael Shellenberger. I'm the president of the Breakthrough Institute and one of the co-sponsors of today's workshops. And I also want to thank Fred Block, who was really the visionary behind revealing the hidden government investments in innovation and technology. So if you sort of look at the challenge in this way, this is total global emissions in 2005. The target that the IPCC, again the Nobel Prize-winning Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, has set is a 50% reduction in emissions by 2050. Here's some of the technologies that would be required to either implement or take offline in order to achieve that goal, and I'll show it in a couple of different ways. This is what we would get if we had every American. I guess it doesn't work up there. There is that thin gray line there. If every American installed 5 compact fluorescent light bulbs, almost unnoticeable difference. Obviously, still a lot to go. This is if every human being on Earth had planted 10 trees. A little bit thicker gray line there, but again, a pretty minuscule amount. This is if every car in the United States were a Prius hybrid. Now you can actually start to see the line a little bit better there. Still a lot to go. If every coal-fired power plant in India were replaced by a power source that did not emit greenhouse gases, you can start to see a slightly bigger reduction, but still a lot to go. If every U.S. coal plant was taken offline and replaced with a clean energy source, much bigger amount, but still obviously a lot to go. And finally, China's coal plants, which it built last year, I think at a rate of 2 a week, would make one of the biggest reductions, but obviously still a lot to go. I'm going to show that the same technological challenge using different data. Last December in Bali, energy experts with the International Energy Agency described what it would take to reduce emissions 50% by 2050. This is their presentation that I'll show. So you can see they said, here's what would be required. You need 30 new nuclear power plants around the world. You would need 17,000 wind turbines. And keep in mind that it's increasingly difficult to site wind turbines and wind farms in various parts of the country, both because of the lack of transmission lines to take that wind to urban areas or large energy consumers, and also because of local opposition to those wind turbines. So right there, a pretty big challenge. And of course on nuclear, we haven't built a new nuclear facility in 30 years. We would need 400 biomass power plants, 2 dams, they said, the size of the Three Gorges Dam. Three Gorges Dam, they started in the 1950s. I think it's still filling up. And 42 coal or natural gas power plants with something called carbon capture and storage, which I'm hoping that our speakers will speak a little bit about, since it's I think a very promising technological innovation to capture emissions from existing plants and bury them underground or under the ocean. And they said you wouldn't do this once, you would do this every year between 2013 and 2030. So the amount of technological, now of course I'm not suggesting and I'm not arguing that these are the technologies we would need to go carbon neutral or to go 50% reductions. Just to give a sense of the scale, you might have solar panels cheaper than coal. You might have very inexpensive air capture machines to vacuum the emissions out of the air. But nonetheless, we're talking about a massive technological innovation, which makes this green case study such a good one, such an interesting and pointed one for this discussion. This is just to give you a sense of the global nature of this, a slide presented by, I think, one of the country's best climate policy experts, Roger Pilkey at University of Colorado. He shows that in 2006, China's emissions were 1.7 gigatons of carbon. Their total carbon emissions were 1.7 gigatons. And then look what's happened, though, and what will happen in the 4 years since. Almost going to double. So by 2010, China's going to bring online another gigaton of carbon. So you can sort of see that number of the total amount that China will bring on from 2007 to 2010 almost exactly matches the total 2004 emissions from those developed countries like Australia, the UK, Canada, Germany, and Japan. So even if Japan were, for example, to reduce its emissions 80%, or if all these countries were to reduce their emissions by 80%, and in fact, they're not reducing their emissions, they've mostly gone up for most of those Kyoto signing countries, you would still not make much of an impact on global emissions or China emissions. And we sometimes, I don't know if you ever play the game with fortune cookies when you go to the Chinese restaurant and you add the words "in bed" after the fortune. It makes them a lot funnier than what they normally are. We think there's a great climate lie detector test where you just add the words "in China" after anything anybody says about climate change. So when people say, no, solar panels are almost as cheap as natural gas, you say "in China," or we have all the technology we need to deal with this problem, in China. And you can sort of ask that question. People are willing to pay a little bit more for energy. Are they willing to do that in China? Just to give you a sense of the scale of this. So we also want to suggest right away that energy innovation is different than other kinds of technology innovations. So electrons are a commodity that few people will pay more for. So the iPhone, you'll spend $300, $600 to buy the latest handheld cellular device. It's not the same with electrons. The vast majority of energy consumers are not going to spend more money to get that energy from wind farms and solar panels. Some do, but it's a very small number of people, mostly in the developed world or in places like Germany where they're spending more on solar panels. So it's really a commodity in that sense, not a consumer item. It's very capital intensive. Bill Gates, Steve Jobs, these guys could start high-tech companies with a little bit of financing. They didn't need a lot of money. In a lot of cases, these guys could start out of their garages. Obviously, a lot of those guys then needed government as their buyer, but they're able to sort of start up small, whereas new energy plants can cost between $3 to $5 billion to begin. So these are not sort of little startup enterprises dominated by big players, which raises one of the questions that the panelists will be thinking about is how do you create a relationship where government supports innovation, but that innovation is taken to another level by private actors. Generally, we've seen the public and policymakers largely opposing efforts to raise the price of fossil fuels. So we saw, obviously, cap and trade failed for a third time in June. We saw not only an unwillingness to raise energy prices, we saw a move to expand offshore oil drilling in the United States. Even in Europe, which is considered very ecologically friendly, they were, at least before the financial crisis, were slated to build 50 new coal plants over the next 5 years. That's even though they have a very high price for carbon dioxide. So you're not seeing a lot of willingness to make fossil fuels more expensive. And then obviously there's this huge technology and price gap between fossil fuels and their alternatives, which I'll show in this slide here. Some people this data is a couple of years old now, but at least it gives you the sense of the different prices. So you can see coal at roughly 4.8 cents a kilowatt hour in contrast to solar PV, which is at least 5 times that. Wind is a bit more cost competitive, but this number, that 6.6 cents a kilowatt hour, doesn't take into account the need to store wind energy, since you can fire up, you can throw coal onto the burner at any time, but wind only, obviously, you get it intermittently. And solar thermal. And some have argued that, well, those prices, this is by the Energy Information Administration, those prices on solar and wind have come down a bit, but again, both in the United States, but also in the developing world like China, coal and fossil fuels remain much cheaper. And you can see, I think Andy's going to do a similar slide on this, but just we've seen a pretty large decline in total U.S. Investment in R&D for the energy sector, really starting in the 80s. Reagan gets blamed for it a lot, but a lot of it is also a response to very low oil prices. So I'm going to end with just some questions. What should our goals for energy innovation policy be? Al Gore has recently argued that we should be at 100% clean energy in 10 years. Is that a good goal? Are there other goals we should think of? What is the relationship between climate policy and energy independence? We can't make fossil fuels much more expensive for political reasons. How could we make clean energy cheap? And then kind of drawing on some of the comments this morning, how can we use government procurement to buy down the price of promising technologies? I think it's worth noting that while Germany has had this feed-in tariff to guarantee a market for solar panels, they haven't seen major price declines in solar panels as a result. So could government procurement, where you have competitive bidding process for solar panels or other technologies, be a better mechanism? And what new institutions do we need? I mean, every time I interview energy experts, they all just sort of grumble about DOE. They think it's a broken institution. So is DOE actually broken, or is it just massively underfunded? And what kind of investment is needed? Is it just for the basic R&D or for other parts of the innovation process, or both? We've got a great lineup of speakers. I'm not going to do big introductions of them. I'm going to start with Andy Revkin, who's a very intrepid reporter for the New York Times. He covers both melting ice caps and also the failure of energy policy innovation in the United States. I'm then going to turn to Dan Sarewitz, who's doing a major project for the National Commission on Energy Policy, focusing on how to actually innovate across, I think, 3 technologies. I don't know if that's changed, Dan. If it has, you can update us. Then I'm going to go to Bob Pollin, who did a very interesting paper for the Center for American Progress recently that was funded by the Cummings Foundation to look at how would you make investments in green technologies and energy efficiency as a way to get economic stimulus. And then we'll end it with John Irons from EPI, who's going to talk about what does actually innovating this look like. And I'm going to ask all the speakers to try to keep their remarks to just 10 or 15 minutes. If you go beyond 15 minutes, I'm going to shut you guys down.
I want to particularly thank Michael Shellenberger and Ted Nordhaus for figuring out somehow how to put innovation onto the map as a climate change issue. It has been stunning and a continual frustration to me, a 4 a.m. frustration to me, the way that climate change and energy discourse for the last 10 or 15 years has noodled at the margins without taking it seriously in terms of both the need to innovate our way out of this problem on one end and the need to adapt to a problem as a condition of society on the other. And in the meantime, we've done Kyoto, which gets us nowhere, and in my view is going to end up looking like a colossal waste of diplomatic, intellectual, and scientific resources. This is an innovation problem, or at least one part of the problem is an innovation problem. And Michael, in his beautifully graphic way, gave you some sense of the scale. So, here in this slide is just a bunch of the kinds of things that we want to have making up an energy system sometime in the future, and the question is how to get there. And one thing to be said that differentiates this problem from a lot of the discussion, not all of it, but a lot of the discussion this morning is this isn't about innovation as just something that we want to foster to enhance competitiveness and enhance well-being through the growth of wealth. This is trying to solve a particular problem. Okay, it's a complex system, the energy system, and we're trying to tweak it to give us a particular outcome. That is to decarbonize it, so that we can deal with this emerging problem of climate change. And that, in many ways, is a very different type of problem than the one that allows a lot more sort of promiscuity of outcomes. So if it's just about economic growth, well, we're pretty good at that, right? And it doesn't really matter what you make. All that matters is that you can add a lot of value to the initial investments in R&D, and that businesses can with not particularly significant initial investments end up being hugely profitable. We all know those models, and we're very fond of them. So in some way, we've been good at this problem of generating growth, and it's cyclical. And there's if you look at sort of the rhetoric about R&D policy over the last 50 years, we're continually in a state of crisis, according to those who are sort of the leading voices in advocating for R&D policy innovation. And my point isn't that that's a hysterical response. My point is that in some sense, that continuing claim that we're not investing enough in R&D, we don't have the right institutional frameworks, or IP isn't being handled correctly, et cetera, is just that's part of the political noise that goes on that allows the system to more or less continually, although in fits and starts, adapt to continually changing circumstances. So we're pretty good at that, and we're good enough that in 100 years we go from, or less than 100 years, from the Wright Flyer to the Boeing 787, with some failed predictions in the middle. For example, none of us have our personal jet suits on, but as we know, those sorts of specific predictions aren't particularly reliable, and those are to be separated from the more general fact that indeed we do know how to catalyze innovation across many different sectors at a fairly consistent and rapid rate, and I'll talk a little bit about how it is that we do that. At the same time, there are some hopeful trends. So in the bottom left, you'll see a figure from a very clever energy analyst, Naki Nakasenovich, who has shown, along with work with Jesse Ausubel, the guy who believes that we'll have methane, infinite amounts of methane from microbes in the Earth's crust forever and ever. What they've shown is that indeed the evolution of energy technologies over periods of decades and centuries gives us a trend towards decarbonization. That is, the types of energy technologies we're using are becoming progressively more able to generate units of energy with less emission of carbon. So this is the direction we want to go. The problem, however, if you look at this graph on the lower left, so where it begins to fan out, that's the present, all right? So that curve that's declining in the right direction, that's the curve of decarbonization. The problem is we don't know what the future is going to look like, all right? And there are many, many possible scenarios, a bunch of which are on that particular figure about what the future could look like. And there's many different factors that are going to interfere with our best plans about driving us towards particular energy outcomes. And some of the obvious candidates are illustrated graphically on this little slide here. So you remember the food riots, the tortilla riots in Mexico, are a reflection of, or a indirect consequence of efforts to generate more ethanol via shifting corn from food to ethanol production. In the middle, palm plantations in tropical forests, leading to increased destruction of tropical forests as a result of meeting increased demand for biodiesel in Europe. And then in the lower right, the Kennedy viewshed off of Martha's Vineyard, and just to indicate that, as someone else I guess has already said, I think Michael already said, that wind power is not without its own political problems. So all of the again, the point is that the system is exceedingly complex, and it's not just a technological system, it's a socio-technical system. There's a lot of politics embedded in it, and getting from the point where we are now to the point where we want to be, which is radical decarbonization of the system, is going to be one that cannot be pursued by following particular deterministic paths. It's going to be one that has to be pursued by following many, many possible leads, most of which will probably fail, which means a high tolerance for risk and hope for the best. But I don't want to be entirely negative about this at all. In fact, I think the point is that we're good at this, that we know how to do this, and we've done it in the past. Procurement's been mentioned a number of times. I think procurement's enormously important. It has played a huge part in advancing most of the technological systems that we're comfortable with today. And yet it seems to be almost off the table in discussions, serious discussions about energy innovation for reasons I don't quite understand. Now, procurement has been also a source of incredible government waste in the productions of weapon systems, for example. But nevertheless, it is, as I think has been recognized already today, a very, very powerful way of creating markets where there might not otherwise be markets. Now, someone this morning suggested, for example, if the government created the demand for plug-in hybrid electric vehicles, that would be a great way to begin to create some market there. I think in general that point's exactly right. The specific point I want to make is we don't really know whether or not that would work for plug-in hybrid electrics or not. What needs to be done is there need to be very fine-grained case studies for a whole array of technologies to try to get some sense of what the policy alternatives might be and provide that sort of innovation mapping for policymakers, for lawmakers, for agency program managers, for a wide range of people who are involved in the innovation system. And Michael mentioned the project that I'm involved in. John Alec is also centrally involved in it. In fact, this list comes from his work from the Heinz Foundation of several years ago. But the idea is that until we actually begin to do a kind of a cross mapping of the policy tools that are available, and there may well be some new innovations of the sort that have been discussed this morning, and the particulars of the technologies that we think are going to need to play a part in decarbonizing the energy system, we're not going to be positioned to really make the decisions that need to be made about how to design an innovation system appropriate to the challenge of climate change. So somebody's going to have to get down there and roll in the mud.
Thanks very much for having me. I'm Bob Pollin from UMass. economics department, and in contrast to the previous talk, mine is going to be very linear. I'm going to propose some fairly straightforward, simple things that I think might work. We have the advantage of right now of an economic crisis that is demanding that we take dramatic steps with respect to economic stimulus, and the economic stimulus offers an opportunity to move forward also in environmental investments. Which one? This one. Okay. So I want to just mention I was testifying in Congress on towards the end of September on this study that I did called Green Recovery, and this was like, I think it was the day that Lehman Brothers was allowed to go down. So of course we've had a financial crisis for over a year, but the magnitude of the crisis was greatly amplified on exactly that day or the day before. But in any case, the other speaker, or one of the other speakers, was from the American Council on Capital Formation, Margot Thorning. And she said, because of the financial crisis, there's really no reason to be talking about these environmental issues at all. So why are we even bothering to have this hearing or talk about this guy's study? So my own view was almost exactly the opposite, is that, as you see, I see that the green economic agenda is actually a major part of the solution to the economic crisis. And in large part, getting back to where Fred was this morning, because it integrates short and long-term imperatives, and I think does it pretty well. Okay, and what do I mean by that? Well, a green investment agenda, which I will specify in a minute, and I am going to make it fairly specific and simple. That's the only way you can embed something in terms of a statistical model. The green investment agenda will promote jobs, it will promote growth. And not only will it do so in absolute terms, but it does so better than a lot of alternatives, including the military alternative that the previous speaker just mentioned. It will advance technological innovation and clean energy. It will serve as a source of financial stabilization. I won't really have time to get into that unless somebody asks, but I'd love to talk about that. And of course, it will stabilize energy markets, reduce dependency on foreign oil, and reduce the trade deficit, which in turn was a major factor in causing the long-term financial destabilization. Okay, I'm going to focus on the employment issues, but these other things will kind of come into play in the process. The first point is, it's easy to say spending money on green investments will create jobs because spending money on anything will create jobs. Okay, so that is not really a benefit in and of itself to say that it's going to create jobs. The questions are how many jobs, whether it's an efficient source of job creation, the quality of jobs created, and what are the larger opportunities that are connected to the process of job creation. Okay, here's the program that I've specified within the context of the U.S. input-output model. Now, you could do other things, and we can do other things. In fact, I've gotten a lot of requests since our study was published to run other things within the framework of the model, and I've done so. But these are the things that I'm going to report some results on. So this is what is the green investment program that I've modeled. That has two features, broad features: energy efficiency measures, including building retrofits, public transportation, again, and smart grid electrical systems. These are pretty simple things. The technologies are entirely known. The results are not matters of uncertainty, and that's very important. The second component is renewable energy, wind, solar, and non-food biomass. Now, as you see the percentages that I've assigned to the different components, it's essentially 70% energy efficiency model and 30% renewable. And the reason is that, as I said, the energy efficiency components are much more certain. The technologies are known. As a stimulus program, Those are very important features. Main leading edge of energy efficiency are things that can be done within the framework of a short-run stimulus. Maybe not within 3 weeks. 3 weeks are things like food stamps, unemployment insurance, reversing cuts in state and local governments, such as my own university. But beyond that, the energy efficiency area are things that can be done within a matter of a couple of months. The renewable energy investments are things that will have payoffs, long-term payoffs, but they'll also have employment payoffs. But those employment payoffs are likely to be somewhat longer, and the magnitudes are smaller. Okay, now what about comparing the job effects? Green investments. So basically, when I call the green investments, that is the components that I just described in exactly that weight. The 70% energy efficiency, of which 40% is building retrofits, and then 20% public transportation, and everything else is 10%. You add those up, and you get about 17 jobs per $1 million of expenditure. Okay, so compare it with some alternatives. Tax cuts for household consumption, which was the leading feature of the February to April stimulus that we already had, that creates about 14 jobs as opposed to about 17 jobs. How about drill, baby, drill? Well, oil and coal, I've combined those two, so that's cheating. That actually raises the number. Oil itself is about 4 jobs, and coal is about, I think, 6.5 or 7. So oil and coal, that's about 5.3 jobs per million of expenditure. And what about the military? Daniel just had a slide up in that book, Is War Necessary for Economic Growth? I know the book well. That book is interesting, is very well done, but it fails to ask the question, is military spending better as an innovation policy or as a jobs policy than some alternative? It assumes this is the alternative. That's the problem. But there are useful lessons within that framework. Okay, so the green investment agenda is very efficient. It not only will create jobs absolutely, it will create jobs relatively compared with these alternatives. Now, why is the green investment agenda creating more of those jobs? The major factor relative to the fossil fuel industry is labor intensity. It entails more people relative per dollar than, for example, having oil shipped from Saudi Arabia or Canada or Texas. Those are much more capital-intensive processes. Domestic content is the second feature. Again, all of the energy efficiency areas are almost 100% U.S. domestic content. They are by nature. You can't retrofit this building in Saudi Arabia or in Canada or Venezuela. It can only be done here. That is not true, by the way, with the renewable investments, as we've been hearing of it. These are very competitive environments, and it's not certain that even wood chips that would be used in Massachusetts. I've had this discussion with my colleagues at UMass. Wood chips that would be used for biomass projects that people are very invested in at UMass would come from Massachusetts. That's just not a given. So those are the major factors here. I just blow up the million jobs per million into $150 billion program, which is in the range of what Obama has been talking about. Though his initial number was $150 billion for 10 years, I'm talking about it for 1 year as part of a broader economic stimulus agenda. But as you can see, the green investment program will create 2.5 million jobs, which is the number that's in the New York Times today as to what Obama's stimulus program intends to create. And you can see it in comparison with the alternatives. So it is a very good jobs program.
So the basic point I'm going to make is that we cannot ignore the implementation phase of innovations, and that technology is not disembodied. Right? A lot of times we think of technology as being some freestanding piece of knowledge or some different way of doing things. In economics, we oftentimes write up economic models with technology as just one factor that stands outside of the normal way we invest and save. But it is embodied in manufactured goods. It's embodied in worker know-how and worker skills, and it must be deployed to be effective. So I'm going to focus on that deployment aspect a bit today, in particular as it relates to the labor market. Let me just kind of dive in with a couple points here. We have to implement these technologies. Solar panels, again, as I said, are embodied in manufactured goods. Wind turbines are embodied again in manufactured goods and must be installed and maintained. Cars obviously have to be manufactured, and energy efficient windows and retrofits are very labor intensive investments. So again, these are embodied in human know-how, human skills. In terms of what this looks like over the future, it's what I call green infrastructure. We're really looking to build an economy that's built on a different kind of broad-based infrastructure, different kinds of roads, different kinds of transit, expanded and smarter electrical grids, energy-efficient buildings. As one example here, there are 97,000 public school buildings in this country that occupy 6.6 billion square feet. So retrofitting just our public school systems would involve an enormous amount of both employment levels as well as energy savings. In terms of policy, let me spend 2 minutes here. Obviously, we must do more to invest in basic science, but we have to back that up with investments in implementation. That means direct spending on infrastructure, defined very broadly. When thinking about the recovery package people are talking about here in DC these days, infrastructure is oftentimes defined as beyond just roads and bridges. It involves mass transit. It involves school buildings. It involves water systems. We waste an enormous amount of water leaking through our sewer systems in this country, not to mention the delivery lines. So there's a range of areas where we really need to invest, broadly speaking, in national infrastructure. We also need some private sector incentives. We can talk about carbon cap and trade, carbon taxes or cap and trade regimes as much as we want. These will provide, a valuable incentive, not just to innovate, but also to deploy those innovations, which, like I said, is very important. And we can also look at manufacturing supports. EPI has produced a paper by Sue Helper, which has looked at providing an extension to the Manufacturing Extension Partnership Program to really gear up a lot of what we can do on the manufacturing side. And as I said before, technology really is embodied in manufacturing in a lot of ways, especially when it comes to green infrastructure. So looking at that sector as well should be fairly important. And then finally, job training ought to be part of the mix as well. So just to wrap up real quickly, as I said half dozen times already, technology is embodied in manufactured goods. It's embodied in worker know-how and skills. And as we implement these new technologies, we have to keep that in mind and design our policies not just to create the innovations, but to implement those in real-world applications.
A lot of what my own research is about is how to finance this. And a lot of what I think should be done, this has got to be financed by the private sector with incentives. You can't do it. There's not enough. I mean, like somebody said, we keep going up. If we have a 7%, 8% fiscal deficit, we will reach a flip point where it becomes dangerous. But so therefore, we need to leverage intelligent programs, tax credit programs, and loan guarantee programs that I think can be very successful in leveraging a lot of private sector, including small business, including especially small business. Because if you talk about tax credits and loan guarantees for energy efficiency in small business, like I said, you get savings in 3 years, and you're fighting global warming.
On adaptation, the issue with the adaptation argument is there's no new normal you're adapting to. It's not like we're jerking up the planet's thermostat from X to Y and just settling in at a new normal. As long as these greenhouse gases the concentration keeps rising, there's never going to be a new normal. So how do you adapt to permanent, no new normal sea level, no new normal climate patterns? That makes it kind of, the uncertainty there, as Gary Yohe at Yale would say, is enough to justify significant investment in trying to divert those trajectories. You can't just adapt your way out of something that's always getting worse or changing.
A lot of what we've talked about today and a lot of innovation policy are investments in the classic economist definition of an investment. It's money outlaid today. They'll yield a return in the future. Those are the kinds of things that you absolutely ought to deficit spend on. The same reason, if you look at a kid of college-going age, and they're deciding, well, do I increase my personal deficit and go to college or not? The answer is absolutely yes. Borrow as much as you can and go to college because it's worth it in the long run. It'll pay off. So I view a lot of what we talked about today as being pure investments that'll yield a return in the future, and that's something we should absolutely borrow for. There are some other things that we probably should talk about in terms of fiscal responsibility down the road, but for investments, I think that's we don't need to worry too much about the deficit.